So with that, without further ado, let me welcome all of you to this event, which is the fourth webinar in the series that we are doing across the world. This one especially focused on the Americas. We could not get a participant or a speaker from US for accepted. Anabel was representing Peterson Institute. She had to drop at the last moment and we could not get hold of somebody else. But that aside, we would be publishing a discussion paper from these webinars. So there's another, after this webinar, there'll be a final webinar, not a final webinar, the fifth webinar to be held on 15th of July. You're welcome to come and listen to that if the timing suits you. It'll be very, very early morning for you. About 4:35 a.m. if you look at Washington time. Now, what we intend to do is to then publish a discussion paper on the issues that we have raised and on the basis of the rich inputs that we have been garnering from all of you. As I wrote to you, we've had the pleasure of participation of some very distinguished experts, Pascal Lamy, Supachai, Kishore Mehbubani, etc., and so on. It's all there. It's all there on our website as well. Now, each of these webinars are also being recorded. So if you wish to see it later, then you will be able to see it on our website, or including we will be circulating the tape. As Vipul just pointed out, this is also being live streamed on YouTube. So there would be much more visual and much more viewers than just the handful who will be here in the Zoom session. We are slowly getting a lot of people joining in, and therefore I would like to welcome you all once again and request Fernando to please kick off. Fernando, since you have a presentation, I would like to treat it as a keynote, and that could help the discussions move forward. That can Fernando's slides be put up, please?
Yeah, it's being done.
Can you please unmute Fernando?
Okay, I need to share the screen. I'm not allowed.
I think we are doing it from here.
Okay, so
is that all right, Fernando?
Yeah, no problem. You will. I will ask you just to move to the next. Let me. This is a very well-known curve that was proposed by Richard Baldwin, and you can see as a distorted image of what happens with health and what happens with the economic crisis. The shortest and the deeper the health crisis, the shortest and less deep will happen with the economy. And this black line shows if there is if your main trading partners are in trouble, are getting in trouble. The more they get in trouble, the more will affect you. No science here, but I believe that is a very telling curve. If you can move it to the next slide, please. Here's the scenarios that the OECD has shown with a single dip and a double dip scenario. So a V recovery and a W recovery. For the next couple of years, things are not going to look pretty for the world economy. And in the next screen, and the next slide, you can see what we all know and has been shown many times on the WTO's forecast of world trade. This was a trend before the financial crisis. Then after the financial crisis, and then when we were hit by the coronavirus. And here's the optimistic scenario. This one is the pessimistic one. If you can move to the next one, please. The next slide, please. And you can see that in the part of the world where I live is going to be the one that is worst hit of them all. I was saying before we started the session that the IMF is forecasting a 10.5 drop in Mexico's GDP this year, and will also have a very slow recovery, just 3.5% next year. And this has terrible consequences, not only for what is going to happen in the economy, but also in the global value chains or the regional value chains we are with the United States and Canada. So if you can move to the next slide, please. What is worth noting is that trade has been in trouble for a long time already. No, it's since the Great Recession. Well, you can see that trade has grown at a pace than world GDP. And this year, well, the crisis is going to be the income elasticity of trade is going to be zero or even below zero. So what had been the engine of growth since the 1950s, you can see it here, it has been has not helped at all. And this has a lot to do with what has been happening between the two main trade partners in the world, no? Between this trade war between China and the United States. If you move to the next slide. Here is what has happened with trade restrictive measures, and which countries have been more severely hit by these measures. And well, if in the next slide you can show that this has not stopped during the past year. Though there's been a slight drop in trade distorting measures, and this Simon Evans, no, this is WTO statistics. The previous one was Simon Evans. But what is interesting, if you can move to the next slide, is that the trade facilitation measures have been very, very fastly during the past year. This is a direct consequence of the health crisis. You need to facilitate trade so as to get all the products you need. No, because what we saw in the second slide is the big drop in world trade. And no doubt, today is the most propitious time to have a well-functioning multilateral trading system. And what you can say is that in the system, the day-to-day business is well functioning, particularly if you look at SPS and trade obstacle, technical obstacles to trade, they are doing well. But what is happening with negotiating function is that has been for the past decade, and of course we have this big problem with the dispute settlement mechanisms. And more than that, no, for all practical purposes, that the bound rates in the WTO are, to be kind with words, in the that is that countries can just increase their tariffs and not even bother to notify to the WTO. And the affected members would also increase their tariff and don't bother either. They can do it ex post facto, but that's it. No, so this is a huge problem for the functioning of the trading systems. And well, no wonder, if you can pass to the next slide. No wonder that the RTAs have grown so fast. This number is not representative because this is the addition of the services agreements and the goods. So the one that contain both of them is this one. Is almost, and it's going to increase not only because what we have been doing already and will continue to do, the CPTPP, the new NAFTA, the one in Africa, the one in Asia, the RCEP, but also because United Kingdom is going to be a very active participant in this effort. And of course, we don't know what is going to happen in November. November is going to provide us with a better grasp of what the situation is in the multilateral system. It's interesting that what we have been talking about of how to fix the WTO. And recently, Mateo Fiorini, Bernard Hegman, Petros Mavrodis, Douglas Nelson, and Robert Wolf conducted a survey on stakeholder preferences and priorities for the next WTO Director General. And this was sent to us. I'm sure that all of you have seen it last Monday, and today, this moment, they are presenting this studies. And if you move to the next slide, please. I'm not going to talk.
Fernando, 5 minutes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here, what you can see is what the priorities, what we said, because I'm sure that you all answered to this question. And here, what you can see is that 80% of the respondents is giving options of making the appellate body operational again and dispute settlement body. That's the main issue that has been answered as with the dispute settlement reform. this is what we, the 800 people that answered to this, we said was the priorities in the reform of the WTO. I'm not going to talk about the Director General. If you want, we can talk about it later on. And in the next slide, what you can see is that, can you move to the next slide, please? Okay. Okay. Well, anyhow, there is really no idea of what is here is. Okay. So in any case, what are we going to have during the next few years, or what do we think that we have to do during the next years is pretty much everything. What is interesting is that the least priority is particularly in which people is still not certain how to deal with this crisis in the organization. What is certain is that we will have a new Director General soon. In the survey, what it says is that the new Director General should not be a technocrat and should be someone, a statesman, a stateswoman that can deal with other people. And well, there is no secret that the November elections in the U.S. will have a big bearing on what is going to happen with the multilateral trading system. You take into account, and we all know that even if the Democrats get both the presidency and the Congress and Senate, we're not certain what is going to happen there. So it's going to take a long time for all of us to try to put things together. And just one last word, this is not a house on fire. This is a house that has a small fire in the kitchen, a small fire in the bathroom and the bedroom, but you don't have to tear down the house to fix it. You have to fix it from within. And in the real world, what is going to happen, and maybe that will help the WTO, is this huge drop in world trade, and the recovery is not going to be an easy one. It will take some time before we start seeing the world coming again to the figures that we have right now on world exports and world imports. And what is for sure is that one way or the other, the global value chains will get smaller and smaller. And let's try to do the best of it. And we're going to see maybe a new world emerge from the crisis. We don't know exactly what this new world would be, but there are going to be a number of changes in the way that we do business until now. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Fernando. And may I now request Ambassador Chad Blackman, 8 to 10 minutes, please, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me say good day to all of you, regardless of where you are in the world. I'll get straight to it, given that we don't have a lot of time. Now, putting it into context, the multilateral trade system, and more specifically, the rules-based multilateral trading system embodied in the WTO continues to be the best option in my view and in my government's view, particularly for developing economies, and in our case, small island states. Now, I think this discussion is coming at a very critical time, particularly given the fact that we are now in the 25th year of the existence of the WTO, coming after the GATT. Now, like anything else, the WTO is not perfect, but certainly it's an improvement on its predecessor, the GATT, as I mentioned, through the institutionalization of a two-stage dispute settlement system mechanism. Now, the practice of decision-making by consensus, I think, really works well because it allows for, I mean, it has its highs and its lows. Namely, for example, when we look at the appellate body crisis that the organization now finds itself in. But when you look at the fact that member states, large, small, landlocked, or coastal, doesn't matter, can be bound to agreements purely by everyone agreeing that this is what we are going to do. It therefore acts as a level playing field of sorts for all member states who are party to the organization to ensure that they have a fair share in the agreements, okay? Now, the organization has and continues to experience some significant challenges. There has been an increase in the rise in protectionism, depressed global trade, and as I mentioned, its inability or the apparent inability to deliver on new multilateral rules. But more importantly, the geopolitical tensions that we now see amongst trading nations and the fight for continued relevance in the international organization setting trade rules and adjudicating trade rules becomes even more critical. Now, furthermore, the recent and current happenings with regards to COVID-19 and the pandemic has really impacted on trade in a very major way. There's no secret about that. The economies of the world have been affected, whether in goods and services. Also, we've now seen, particularly developing countries, smaller and developing states, whose economies were vulnerable even before COVID-19 has become even more acutely so within the last 3-4 months. But the thing is this, and this is one of the points that I really want to make. Without the WTO, a number of these states would be in a lot worse position. And therefore, I really echo the sentiment of our previous panelists, where he said, despite there is a small fire in the bathroom, you don't destroy the house. You try to out that fire and make it more resilient so as to withstand and move forward. Now, in recognizing these challenges, there has been an overwhelming number of countries that have called for reform of the WTO in recent years. This call is not new. There has been a concerted effort made on the part of developing countries to call for the leveling of the playing field after the conclusion, for example, of the Uruguay round and throughout the Doha development round. And we all know, I assume, where we are with that, or where we are not, perhaps. The calls in more recent times have been led by those countries who have been the architects of the system and have to a great extent been focused on a few core geopolitical issues, which have basically brought us full circle to our discussion today in terms of the organization's role in underwriting peace, stability, and prosperity. Now, the new dynamics in the organization have resulted in a shift towards plurilateralism, marked by changes in country and group alliances. This has really underscored the shift, and in some instances, a retreat towards the use of power and economic and political might. Now, to date, just a quarter of the members of the WTO have opted to participate in the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement, including the countries is one LDC member and a few small vulnerable economies. Now, on its face, we must know that there are some characteristics between the principles outlined in the multi-party arbitration arrangement and those that made many developing countries, like Barbados, for example, have consistently listed as critical elements for the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism. These include the importance of preserving the essential features of the WTO dispute settlement system, and in particular, its binding character. Very important, its binding character. Its two-stage adjudication process through an independent and impartial appellate review process, as well as the preservation of members' rights and obligations under the WTO agreements. Now, it must be noted that although the MIPA, as it's commonly called, is largely based on Article 25 of the Dispute Settlement Understanding and is open to other WTO members to join, it is clear that all WTO members continue to have recourse to Article 25 without having to become a member of the MPIA. Now, going further along, I want to then look at what are some of the benefits that we've been able to accrue as a global community in the advent of membership of the WTO. Now, let's look at the fact that the organization is built in its mandates or regular work on monitoring and transparency and continues to be a critical aspect of the organization. Small developing states with limited resources and capacities can oftentimes be challenged to undertake notification commitments on time. Discussions on this area must, however, not seek to impose overly burdensome requirements on these developing countries because there are a lot of inherent capacity constraints that exist. While technical assistance and capacity building is welcome, the members should resist the urge to suggest that the application of punitive measures, which has been a very ongoing discussion in the event of late notifications, because as I said, some countries, based on their geography, based on their size, based on their lack of resources, are inherently unable to be able to notify within the time that other larger or more developed or advanced economies can do so. Now, developing countries, on that point, have been listed as having a low submission record for some aspects of services notifications. As I mentioned, some of the reasons are there. Now, and this point must be made, transparency alone will not satisfy the interests of developing countries in a conversation on WTO reform. There is an overall need, and I can't stress this enough, there is an overall need for balance which seeks to ensure that the interests of all members are not only taken into consideration, but that the interests of the members themselves, particularly those who are smaller and vulnerable, are taken up. Now, there are other built-in mandates within the organization covered in the agreements, including negotiations in the area of agriculture and services, and which speak specifically to the flexibilities and the pursuit of interests of developing countries and least developed countries. There are also negotiating mandates which speak to the issues of interest of deserving and sustained discussion and political will. So, for example, paragraph 44 of the Doha Ministerial Declaration states, and I quote, "All special and differential treatment provisions shall be reviewed with a view to strengthening them and making them more precise, effective, and operational." So therefore, when you look at the whole aspect of special and differential treatment, it is enshrined in the organization. Now, as we may be aware, robust debate where countries have said that a number of countries ought not to be able to benefit from special and differential treatment. But this was something that was agreed by all members. So therefore, countries who have used that provision are not running afoul of the organization. They're simply using the provision that all have agreed to based on the fact that you're a developing country and so self-designated. Now, members in the organization often speak about replicating the trade facilitation agreement model without defining precisely what is meant by that.
How long would you take to please wind up?
I can wrap up. I have a long presentation here, but I can make it very condensed. That's no problem. How much time do I have?
Another couple of minutes.
Okay, I will make it in 2, no problem. Now, sure, that's fine. As I was saying, the members often speak about replicating the trade facilitation agreement model without defining precisely what that really is. I truly believe, particularly given my role here as the ambassador to the WTO, that the strength of the trade facilitation agreement lies in its unique and special and differential treatment provisions, which allow developing and least developed members to self-designate, as I would have mentioned. Now, the trade facilitation facility, which was established at the request of developing and least development developed countries, sorry, has also been a useful tool aimed at ensuring that these countries receive the assistance they need to support the implementation of the agreements by all members to reap the full benefits of the TFA. So, admittedly, not all aspects of all of the agreements and texts may be conducive to trade facilitation agreement and its approach, but to the extent that this template could be replicated, it could serve as a useful tool in advancing special and differential treatment based on a country's unique perspectives and needs and interests in its development quest. So I will stop there for now, and then perhaps any questions that will come in the Q&A I can answer.
I think two important points which you made worth recalling is that the developing world needs the WTO to protect itself. Number one. Number two is the TFA could be a good template for any future negotiations. With that, let me come to Rohinton Medhora, who's not a diplomat in that sense, as we've had two other speakers. Rohinton runs the Center for International Governance Institution, which has done a lot of work on WTO. Rohinton, over to you, about 8 to 10 minutes.
Pradeep, thank you. And I'd like to thank you and CUTS for having me, and more importantly, for organizing these sets of discussions which really animate what the key issues are. And I've been following them with great interest. The theme of this discussion is effectively, can we visualize a world without the WTO, or what might it look like? And I guess to cut to the end, my answer, like any good economists, would be it depends. And so to reach that answer, let me sort of make a few points that actually build on what the previous two speakers have said in different ways. The first is that the COVID-19 crisis has been a crisis in many ways, including and especially for global trade, but more importantly for the precepts that drive trade. Trade is a bellwether of something else, and that something else is confidence in cooperation, attitudes to cooperation, confidence in the global economy, and simply the value of doing things that go beyond your national borders. And so the statistics we saw in the first presentation were quite stark, and I think were quite indicative. I thought more indicative than the declines in the volumes of trade was how it happened, and how haphazardly it happened, and how sidelined the WTO was in all of this. And so in the first 3 or 4 months of the crisis, we've seen countries impose last-minute ad hoc measures which restrict exports, for example, of medicine and medical supplies, of PPE, and sometimes of food. And this has been done without, in some cases, informing the other countries, certainly not informing the WTO or the G20. And so I guess I'm saying when it comes to trade, WTO is not first on people's minds and on decision makers' minds. I think that's more worrisome than the trade volumes themselves. The second point I'd make here is that this kind of lack of confidence in global cooperation predates the crisis. And so the WTO was in crisis previously, and what this crisis simply showed in very stark terms is that that remains the case. And then a third point, which I'd like to come back to perhaps even in the discussion, is around intellectual property. And the fact that if we're going to come out of this crisis, and if you visualize a world in which treatments and vaccines have been scientifically discovered, all the rest, how are they distributed? What are the logistics? At what price? On whose terms? That's all classic WTO stuff on which we don't necessarily have the rules in place. Or if they are, they're not the ones we would like to see in place. And so one way I'd answer your question of can we visualize a world without the WTO is to say, well, how much more haphazard could it be? And so if we could simply freeze where we are currently, that's a reasonably acceptable scenario. But if what that really means is things getting much, much worse, then clearly it isn't. So let me move to that story for just a bit. In my view, and as Pradeep noted, my colleagues and I at CIGI have been sort of writing about this and speaking about it recently, the the drift in the WTO is actually a sign of its success. It's a sign of its success in the sense that when the GATT articles were framed, and then when the WTO was created subsequently, there were a series of exceptions that were deliberately built in by the founding fathers, precisely because they understood that trade is a very national thing, and the only way we could get countries to buy in is by creating all of these exceptions. And so the exceptions are well known. Regional trade agreements, which one of the speakers alluded to, are explicitly allowed, 303 of them in force at present. There's all kinds of exceptions related to health, the environment, public morals, balance of payments spikes, security. And so we already had an agreement that wasn't as watertight as we would like to think, not as watertight as its supporters would like to think, and not as restrictive as its detractors would like to think. I think the WTO is deliberately flexible because that's the only way we would have any kind of global governance structure around trade. So, we now find countries using those exceptions. We find countries saying, I'd rather sign on to 7 regional trade agreements than be only beholden to the WTO. That's the only way to explain that 303 number. The other exception in many ways success that strikes us is that in the early days, success came easily because it was all about tariff reduction. So we went from something like 22% in the post-war era to 3 to 4% today. Once tariffs had been reduced to reasonably acceptable levels, what you were left with were all the difficult issues: agriculture and all the behind the border stuff, competition, investment, IP. No wonder then that the WTO is seen to be ill-suited to deal with these issues, because all the low-hanging fruit have been gone. And so if you have a world in which we've become inward-looking and we question cooperation, this is not the time to be tackling those very complex issues, and certainly not the time to be tackling them through the single undertaking approach. And so my sense is that if we locked in where we were, then that may not be a bad thing. And as other speakers have alluded, there's 2 or 3 important events coming up. And as the chat function to this event shows, we're not going to see any kind of movement in the next year or so. We have the US elections, we have the selection of the head of the WTO, and we have the second phase, or the exit from the pandemic once a vaccine is discovered. I don't think we're going to focus our minds on those big issues until then, but let me leave you with this thought. If you ask yourself, what are the big issues that we currently face globally? It doesn't have to be trade. I'd say climate change and the environment, for which the WTO-centered answer might be border carbon adjustments. Second, the digitization and growth of the data-driven economy, in which case some kind of data governance regime is in place. And then third, to continue to experiment, which is where regional trade agreements are exceptionally good. In all of those 3 cases, I can see a role for the WTO. It's not the role that we've seen in the last 25 or even 50 years, but there is a role. It's a deep agenda. We need to see ourselves out of this crisis. Obviously, dispute resolution is a part of all of that, but I don't think the next 12 to 18 months is when we will see a lot of that movement. Beyond that, I don't see us moving without having rules around trade, because dealing with some of the other vexing issues crucially involve trade. So let me stop there at this point, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Rohinton. I would like to come back to you with a question on multilateralism at large. You did speak about climate change and so on, but that is something which will be very helpful to hear you. Juliana? Juliana?
Yes, thank you.
Hi. Please, about 8 to 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Pradeep, and Katz for the invitation. Greetings to everyone, and thank you all the speakers that made some very insightful thoughts. I have few points I'll try to summarize. Maybe some points were made by previous speakers, especially Mr. Rohinton. So I'll try to reformulate them a little bit. First, I think looking back in time, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I think the WTO was the first multilateral organization to reflect the crisis in global governance, given due ongoing changes in the world balance of power. So in this sense, I wrote 10 years ago with Diana Tassi, for instance, that WTO was the canary in the coal mine because WTO was announcing the lack of oxygen in multilateral governance. So for many reasons, because the WTO does not have a weighting voting system, because it's the most transparent of all multilateral organizations with binding rules, of course, and it's also the most accountable to its members. So this is why the WTO was the first one to reflect those changes in the global scenario. So, but I think 10 years ago that we were still in a crisis within a framework. Now we can see a crisis in a pandemic context and I don't know if chaos, but at least an emerging global order that we don't understand very well yet. So the WTO now it's really facing the deepest crisis since its foundation in 1995. And it's a crisis that is challenging the two most important assets I think the WTO has provided to multilateral governance as a public good, which are the ability to be a forum for negotiations based on agreed rules and the capacity to provide a successful dispute settlement system to its members. So I have some cautious points too. I think, as I think Rohinton made this point, that the WTO was victim of its own success because, and this huge success is directly linked to a very short period of consensus in the multilateral trading systems, which is very unusual in the history of multilateral trading systems. So in IR terms, for instance, it's the brief unipolar period we have experienced during the 90s. So examples of this exceptional period that shaped the WTO are, for instance, the appellate body and its capacity to create law by its interpretation mandate. It's very exceptional in the history. The single undertaking principle or the trade policy review mechanism and so on. So I think these achievements were very important to take trade to another level in terms of setting common rules and binding rules, but they also reduce flexibility from the WTO to adapt to these changes that we have started to see by then. So I think maybe we are missing something that was very exceptional in the history of multilateral trading system. So if you want to save or rebuild some parts of this public good, meaning the WTO, we need to think, at least for now, for this crisis, I don't know if it will take months, years, I hope months, more than years. We have to think about in a WTO as a common ground, an arena for negotiations, with very little expectations on the agenda in terms of content and binding rules. So I think after rebuilding the ties of trust, we can think about setting agenda, new agendas, for instance, data protection that I think is in the front line of the emerging world bipolarity, whatever we call it. Old agendas such as special and differential treatment. I think the WTO also needs a new narrative, an attractive one for the world, the people at large, the public opinion, and I'm not sure, but it also must, I don't know how, to give answers to distributional effects of trade. As Amrita Nalika wrote recently, we need a grand bargain, ambitions, grand bargain, no small changes, no? Because I think trade will take its time to recover, but it will recover. The question is in which position the WTO will be by then. So I think this kind of thinking and measures could help prevent the WTO from irrelevance in a new future. So in this new emerging world. So I could stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you very much. May I now turn to Alejandro?
Thank you. Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you very much. Good day to you all. See many familiar names.
Alejandro, I see two of you.
I only see one.
Your beautiful portrait.
Oh, that's right. Okay. I see many familiar names across the screens. Hello to all friends. It's difficult to say something new after so much wisdom has been spread around by previous speakers. But let me touch on 2-3 points. I think we all agree that WTO needs reform. It's in a crisis. It has been for several years now, at least since the collapse of the Doha round negotiations in 2008. And the WTO needs reform because it can never go back to be what it was. It needs to change. You need negotiations to do that. They will take long, very long. And but in order to kickstart negotiations, you need trust. And that is, I think, pretty much inexistent at this point in time. How to rebuild trust? There are many different ideas in that respect. My own approach is one, through a political understanding of at least the major members about the limit on appellate body and then the dispute settlement mechanism, generally speaking, reinstate the functioning of an appellate body. And secondly, improve transparency. Now, I've always been amused by the fact that when people think about transparency, they go to notifications and the whole system. Now, that's technology of the 1950s. If notifications is getting to learn what's happening in other countries, it's much easier today to Google or use other search engines. And the Secretary has proven that it can and should collect information, not notify, collect information, organize information to make it more available to different governments and other stakeholders. So things can change very quickly in that respect and improve the raw material with which to improve the set of disciplines of WTO. I think we also need some kind of a political understanding in terms of a standstill on trade distorting subsidies before we go into reform the rules that we have at present. Having said that, a world without the WTO, I don't think that that is going to ever happen. I don't think the WTO is going to implode or explode. But I could envisage maybe a trade organization without the whole world, meaning perhaps some countries, 1 or 2 or more, decide to leave the WTO for whatever reason. And I then reflect that while that I think it's at present unlikely, It could happen, but I don't think that that will mean that the WTO will disappear. Now that leads me to a reflection. As we speak, as we consider and speculate on this, I think that out there, a new, let me put it, a new world is organizing itself. And here, Fernando's slide showed it very clearly. Because of free trade agreements, many of the institutions of the WTO, many of the disciplines, etc., are being included in such free trade agreements. And because of the number of countries involved increasing, and because of the size of the economies involved in this exercise, it's also increasing. I think slowly, sometimes not so slowly, but regularly, free trade agreements are picking up the different institutions and deepening them and improving on the disciplines in such a way that we have, I would say, the expressions of where countries want to go in terms of their trade policies and in terms of what international cooperation should be. There are some minimum common denominators in this respect, which are very interesting to observe. Let me say something in this respect. Almost by definition, free trade agreements are reciprocal. So countries such as, let's say, Vietnam, or Malaysia, or Singapore, or Chile, or Mexico, or Peru, Costa Rica, and so on and so forth, China, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, have demonstrated that they can liberalize trade completely, or almost completely, on a reciprocal basis, and that they haven't had need to any S&D or any other flexibilities. Okay, maybe there will be one flexibility here, one. I think that that's an inherent to trade agreements. Some flexibilities are necessary. But for the most part, the number of countries that are embracing the reciprocal approach is increasing. Just think of Mercosur countries. Argentina and Brazil in particular have in the past been unable to strike any meaningful free trade agreement with other partners around the world. If they approve the agreement they have struck with the European Union, they will join this bandwagon as well. So that increases. So I think that we have a different world which is in the making now. And that I think should lend international cooperation and trade the necessary support, and that should also show the way in which countries, through their behavior, are envisioning the future of international cooperation on trade. And on this, and I think I fully agree with Rohinton and his very, I'd say, good remarks, that it would be crucial also how to integrate this with the challenges on climate change, with the fact that we have a digital economy that is growing, and even more so in this pandemic, etc. And as he rightly pointed out, the continued experimentation through free trade agreements, I think, is something which is very important, because it's a way in which countries are reforming the WTO on a less than multilateral basis. And by the same token, the efforts that are being carried out in plurilateral negotiations in Geneva is also meaningful in terms that the machine is not stopping because the WTO is in crisis and has been unable to begin a process of reform of itself. I'll stop there with my remarks. Thank you, Pradeep.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. And that was excellent remarks, particularly the important point made by Rohinton, which you also flagged. Ultimately, the common denominator is international cooperation. Spoke about climate change, and as you notice, what this pandemic has also done is also to have lowered the trust in the World Health Organization. So you're looking at, more and more attack on multilateralism, as it were. May I request Rohinton to respond to this? The increasing lack of trust in multilateral bodies.
My sense, Pradeep, is that these are cyclical. There was a huge sort of boost in trust and cooperation in the 1950s, mainly because we had seen what lack of cooperation looks like in the previous 2 decades. Then you found that in the 70s, with the debt crises and the quite intrusive nature of the Bretton Woods institutions, there was once again the sense, centered mainly in developing countries, but globally also, that this has gone too far. Then we found another period in the 80s and perhaps 90s where we saw globalization and the flattening of the earth as a good thing. And we are now once again in, so I guess I'm saying, if you look at the last 60 years, these things wax and wane. They're not always because of the actions of the international actors, but they wax and wane. My hopeful scenario is that we take the reconstruction or the coming out of the pandemic and the huge public investments and the fact that fiscal rules are being thrown out the window, we take all of this to create a world that is cleaner and fairer in some ways. And the only way you can do that is by also having globally cooperative arrangements. And so that was my point when I said, never mind the WTO. It's very easy in groups like this to get so caught in the minutiae of trade negotiations. But just ask yourself, what are the 2 or 3 big issues that we as a global community face? And I mentioned them. I think the climate and new technologies are the top 2. And then work backwards from there by asking yourself, if we want to make progress in this, what role is there for trade governance? And then the secondary question is, how much of that has to be done centrally, i.e. at the WTO, and how much can you use the subsidiarity principle to do at the regional and national level? So I think this is a good time to sort of pause, take a deep breath, ride out this particular wave, but quietly show that you cannot have any kind of sensible recovery without global cooperation. And that's, by the way, even the case for large countries that have large domestic markets. And I have in mind China and the US. Neither of those countries, and they know it, can really come out of this pandemic without having a global agenda. It may be different agendas, and that's where mediation comes in, but I don't think all is lost for the concept of cooperation.
Rohinton, there is a specific question to you, and I'll take up questions from the audience. Do you see administering current agreements the only way forward for the WTO in the next couple of decades, and shifting of rulemaking to bilateral agreements and larger regional trade agreements, such as TPP or RCEP or USMCA?
By definition, regional agreements will be more efficient and agile. One, because you're with your neighbors, you're with people that you just know and understand better or for worse. And second, there are just fewer numbers involved. And so the kinds of disparities you see among 160 plus countries, you will not see if you have 7 or 20 countries involved. So, I mean, I get that. I also think that cuts 2 ways. On the one hand, and this is a point that Alejandro noted as well, this is exactly what RTAs were in some cases set up for. And in fact, Juliana and Diana have written about this, that these are hothouses for experimentation. And one can all come with cases where you experiment at that level, and then you pitch it up if something works to a multilateral level. So I think that function of RTAs, which is regional confidence building, regional peace, going back to the European case, and in fact, experimentation is where it's at. Now, the flip side is something that also increasingly worries me. In regional agreements, power imbalances are more pronounced. And so if you take, for example, the case of where the US is a member of an agreement, by definition, it's going to be more influential in a small plurilateral agreement than at the WTO. And we see this in NAFTA phase 2. We have seen, for example, provisions on data localization and on use of the safe harbor provision to shield the digital platforms from content regulation inserted into NAFTA. These are things that would have been in TPP had it stayed. And so you have a ratcheting in effect in which a hegemon uses a regional agreement to sort of lock in a certain arrangement, and then that becomes multilateral. And so the challenge here is, on the one hand, to have experimentation, but on the other hand, not use this as one more way to ratchet up agreements that may not necessarily be beneficial to all. That's sort of the trade-off that we're going to have to face increasingly as we move forward.
Thank you. Now, this is a question to all the panelists, that in terms of the fact that the Chinese economy is hard, mostly sort of dependent upon state aid, as it were. And that was as against the kind of, and that is one grouse which Trump had against China, that, they have been enjoying the advantage of WTO very unfairly, as being one of the reasons for the loss of trust, as it were, in, by the US in the WTO system. This is, as some commentators have also said. So can I start with you, Fernando, on this question? I mean, it wasn't visualized when China sought accession and when it was being negotiated with the other countries at that point of time.
Okay. Here. Listen, I believe we have to deal with is with precisely state trade aid to the different companies. Now, at this particular moment in time, we have to deal with that with every country that has been providing this kind of aid to soften the heat on the economy because of the COVID-19. In the case of China, of course, is one of the main elements we have to try during the reform of the system, and this is one of the issues that most people have been talking about. And there are, to start with, as I mentioned before, is the dispute settlement system to fix it. And of course, what happened to the appellate body, but also we have to deal with other important issues, state trade enterprises and aid to other enterprises. But we are far beyond that point right now. Now, what we have to do is, because of this crisis, economic crisis that we are all immersed in, we require to fix the whole structure of the WTO. And as was mentioned before, the first thing that the new Director General has to do is to sit down with the two main warriors in the international arena and with other important participants in the world trade, and try to establish a new trust in the organization. And I completely agree with Rohinton. This question about trust in the international organizations is something like a cyclical situation. Yesterday, I posted something about the answers I got is that Mexico would have to leave the WHO for some reason unknown to me. But that shows that also WHO is very unpopular nowadays, and is the moment when we need most both the WHO in the health segment, and the WTO in the trade one. And I'm afraid that you can fix some things with the regional trade agreements, but if you don't have the umbrella of the WTO, and you can start just doing whatever you want with the different trade distorting measures is as well, particularly the ones that have the least power and economical power in those agreements, and we are part of one of them.
Thank you. Thank you. May I now request Alejandro? Alejandro, when I mentioned state aid, I should have also said state-owned enterprises. That's been something also which has been discussed very vigorously in the TPP, which US backed out of. Alejandro, over to you.
Thank you. I think that here again, state aid in China and subsidization, generally speaking, is rampant around the world. We see how much money was thrown around in the 2008-2009 crisis. We really don't know about state aid, for example, that takes place at sub-federal levels in countries that have federal structures. There's little accountability in that respect. So I think we need a lot more, first of all, in having the right information and having it organized in such a way in which we can work with it. I think we need a lot more in terms of management, political management of issues around subsidies. Let me give you an example. United States and the EU, Airbus and Boeing, they've been litigating since 2005, and they're still at it, okay? When such litigation, WTO, takes so long, and you see there's no settlement possible in the short run, then that signals to me that there's something wrong with the rules that we have. So we need to sit back and to have a dispassionate look at this, et cetera, so that we can improve the rule book in order to make everyone comfortable enough in terms of the kinds of subsidies that governments use, the kind of assistance that is provided, and the impact thereof, so that we can define what is tolerable and what is not, and that we can have a process, a continuous process in terms of having these issues discussed, having these issues being analyzed. And here I think that the WTO Secretariat can play a huge role in terms, again, of collecting information, organizing the information, and creating the right setting for countries to have an intelligent discussion over these issues. So we still have a lot to do, but again, I think we now have the tools and that things can move along to create a basis on which to rebuild that trust, thinking of subsidization, state aid, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Another question, this could of course be answered by other panelists as well, but I would like to raise another question, which is would the panelists agree that much of what has been agreed in WTO, in particular TRIPS and agriculture, has not helped developing countries? On the contrary, it has harmed their development. With that, may I request Chad Blackman? Chad, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I just had to get my mic unmuted. Well, let me say to the question specifically, there have been challenges, particularly faced by developing countries in regards to the TRIPS and agriculture. But it has not only been the developing countries who have had issues, but equally there are opportunities within that. But if I should answer this question, I would like to make reference to something that Alejandro just said. I think there has to be a very clear restock and relook at some of these things. And we don't need to, as that saying go, throw out the baby with the bathwater, if I should use that saying. And I think now, in its 25th anniversary as an organization, it's time to really have a relook at some of the rules and to see how have all countries, large or small, developed or developing, benefited or not benefited, and see how can we adjust these rules to ensure that it's within the fair and comprehensive interest of all members. Okay. Now, when you balance that with the reality that it's a very difficult time for countries now, particularly in the whole aspect of the pandemic, the whole aspect of intellectual property is critical. Many of the countries, particularly developing countries, have had to endure a very, very tough time where export restrictions on goods that were needed to help them fight the pandemic is a very real reality. Okay. Capacity issues. Which countries own the intellectual property to some of the goods and services that developing countries need? And there then has to then look at the whole aspect of the capacity building of these countries and what rules are built into the organization to allow for developing countries to not just benefit from it in times of crisis, but as we go forward, being strong, robust, competitive economies, notwithstanding our size, for example. So as I said, WTO reform isn't only about looking at the rules in terms of issues of the dispute settlement body, but I also think it's time for us to have an intricate look to see how are these rules going to ensure that all countries have a level playing field, notwithstanding size and resources, to be able to allow each member state to effectively compete within the world economy. The issue of agriculture is a very serious one. Food security, again, for developing countries is a very critical one. And again, this was brought home even closer during this pandemic. A number of our countries in the Caribbean and also in the Pacific region have had to rely and continue to rely on food from regions outside of our own. But when you have a situation where some countries limited their export of that food, which countries rely on entirely, you then ask yourself, in terms of agriculture, how can we use the rules in agriculture to allow for not just countries as individuals, but one of the panelists mentioned the whole aspect of regional trade agreements. How can we use those regional trade spaces to leverage our size or lack thereof, but to become competitive in a very sustainable way and being able to provide the necessary resources, food, agriculture, not just for the consumers, but also our value chains for export. Okay, so I really think that it's time to have a good close look at where we are and how do we look at the rules and marry those rules with the original objectives of why the organization was set up. Sometimes you have to take stock, but you don't take stock by changing the objectives. You change the rules so as to ensure that the objectives are met. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Chad. And this is just to remind everybody about the preamble of the WTO is to raise the living standards of people all over the world and not just in few countries. The problem with the Doha Development Agenda came to a standstill because the US, for example, thought it was a market access round, and the development world was actually inserted only to bring in, people back on board. And in fact, if you also recall, Fernando and Alejandro would recall that when the Marrakesh Agreement was signed in 1994, it was thought that the WTO will be a permanent negotiating forum, and therefore you had an inbuilt agenda in all such agreements. And there was no issue about, our friend, the then US President at Seattle wanted to launch the Millennium Round, but that didn't work for various reasons. And then finally it came back to Geneva, and ultimately when 9/11 took place, that, this whole thing about the Doha Development Round came into being, when in fact, when you look down the sort of down the time, there's really development was was hardly an issue, which is the only good thing which came out of Doha was the WTO and TRIPS agreement, the TRIPS and Public Health Agreement. by which, Chad, when you speak about medicines and TRIPS, etc., where AIDS medicines were particularly allowed to be imported by countries without the manufacturing capacity, uh, having the and without violating any of the TRIPS agreement. So that was a very good, and that again was something which happened because of a lot of civil society pressure. That is something which has to be admitted. Man, let me go to Alejandro. I'm sorry, let me go to Juliana. Juliana, there are both issues. One was TRIPS in agriculture, and the other was about the state-owned enterprises and state subsidies in China, which were which the US and many others have thought to be very unfair, and that this would also then require a reform in terms of rules. Vipul, I'll come to you later. Juliana?
See, sorry, Pradeep, I was checking the chat and answering by so I'm about state enterprises and
state
question. Yes, I think
it's designed like that. The whole Chinese economy grew up with a lot of state support.
Okay. As I was saying, seeing that the new NAFTA, for instance, in terms of rules, the chapter, I think it's the 14 competition policies, you see the difference in this new world. The chapter doesn't have a dispute settlement system as NAFTA. So, and this is the reflect of the regression or the kind of we are going back in time about this kind of policies. So I think we have to, I would say again, to set the common ground again for negotiation, because rules are changing. The USMCA, sorry, the TMAC for us in Spanish, it's a very good indicative of this. If you want to avoid talk about China and the state capitalism of China. So I think there's no possibility right now to go back in this binding rules of competition, because they are in the integration process in a regional basis, they are changing. So I don't want to sound negative, but I will be more cautious about this kind of rules in the WTO right now.
Juliana, can you answer the question whether TRIPS in agriculture was was it helpful to the developing world?
Sorry, the
TRIPS and agriculture.
Okay. Yes, as a Brazilian in Argentina, it's not a question very easy, because we have two sectors, one offensive and one defensive in global exporters of food and more familiar agriculture sector. So I think that for these kind of countries, we cannot see big problems in the pandemic context. I think about net importers or some or countries with other profiles, as Chad said. So yes, in that case, I see more problem, even though I accept that we need to keep our commercial trade and avoid deficit in Argentina. This is a huge problem right now. So I think it depends on the country profiles. to if you not in aggregated terms, we have to see point by point.
Thank you. Thank you. Alejandro, on the issue about China.
What do you mean the issue about China?
No, should rules be, framed in a manner that was discussed in TPP also, in terms of curbing state-owned enterprises, in terms of the kind of unfair competition which happens?
Yeah, well, just one thing. I don't think it's about state-owned enterprises or subsidization provided by states, et cetera, et cetera. All countries do it one way or the other, but I think it's very important to see what is the impact of that of state-owned enterprises, how they behave, how they control, do they compete or not with private sector enterprises and so on. So the situation varies from economy to economy, and therefore I think that it's not necessarily about China or about this or that. State trading enterprises are not bad per se. State-owned enterprises are not bad per se. It just depends what kind of regulatory environment they have, how protected, and what other distortions they may bring to the markets. And this will change. And I think we need information to say something. I think the TPP is some improvement in terms that it provides a framework within which to greatly improve transparency in this respect. But I also wanted to make a point here. I think that we have seen an increase in terms of regulatory activity worldwide, and as my former boss Pascal Lamy has said, the society is moving more to protecting the consumer, the human being, than protecting the producer. This means more regulations, and these regulations have an impact on trade, how to level the playing field. There's no room for preferential treatment here when it comes to life or health of plant, animals, or human beings. And therefore, the process by which these regulations are made and the impact of such regulations is crucial to have good processes where these can be discussed. More or less like what has taken place in technical barriers to trade committee work in WTO or the sanitary phytosanitary work. And in that has shown the way to go in a great respect, that we need more, not less. And by the way, when it comes, for example, to services and all these regulatory activity, what do you mean? What does one mean by saying we have to liberalize trade and services? And what really means is you're dealing with regulatory environments which touch the raw nerve of civil society in a big way. But there again, the way to level the playing field there is not to get rid of the regulations, but to cooperate in terms of what are the regulations and the possible impact they have on trade. And that becomes really a discussion about competition policy. And I think once has that clear in mind, I think you must have the right framework within which to advance international governance and cooperation in the field of services and in the face of all this increase in regulatory activity worldwide. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. May I now request Vipul?
Yeah. No, I have a few quick points to make. First, while I agree that given the complexity of the situation where we are in respect to the multilateral trading system, it is time to take a deep pause and deliberate upon the positives and negatives of the system as it has evolved over time. At the same time, this COVID-19 induced crisis, which we are seeing in the health sector, very soon we may see some serious crisis in the food sector. Now here comes a dilemma that WTO is more or less about dealing with the import measures. there is hardly any rules to deal with export measures. I'm talking about export restrictions. So my first question is to Ambassador Blackman. Do you think that it is possible in a limited way to have some kind of an agreement
Vipul,
on export restrictions? Yeah.
Vipul, Ambassador Blackman has left.
Oh, then sorry. I mean, let me pose this to both Alejandro and Fernando. That is it possible to have some kind of a limited agreement to deal with export restrictions, particularly on those essential commodities which are needed for fulfilling our basic needs? And my second and final point is perhaps it is addressed to Rohinton may do that, is that you see, whether we like it or not, there are two systems in place, two different systems of economic governance, two different systems of political governance. I'm talking about the largest two powers, trading and otherwise. Is it possible for them to coexist? I mean, whether we like it or not, I mean, Americans, their system was developed through the free, quote unquote, free market principles, whereas the Chinese economy, they got developed as a result of state aid and not the free market principles. So my question to you, Rohinton, is how can they at least agree to disagree?
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you. Can I start with Rohinton?
Sure.
Rohinton?
Look, I mean, I would echo, although I'm not attributing all of this to him, but
Hello?
I would, can you hear
Hello,
me?
Rohinton, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Good. I was going to say that, you know, to Bipul's final point, I would echo, although I'm not saying everything I will say is what Alejandro meant necessarily, but I would echo the point that the difference between the two large economies is not as profound as we think. In the US case, defense spending and the space program in particular have been huge boosters of private sector competitiveness. And it is in many ways state capitalism. It may not look the same as the Chinese model, but the point that we live in a world in which there are different mixed models is really the way to look at it. I will also take this opportunity to plug my colleague's book, Paul Bluestein's book, Schism, which many of you will have seen. Exactly, thank you, Alejandro, on China's entry into the WTO and how it played more or less within those rules to achieve what it did. And I think there's a lesson there. And the lesson is, as he says, there was room for a grand coalition to challenge China within WTO rules. Instead, the US chose to go it alone. I think the beauty of global rules is we may not all be happy with them, but we can use them in different ways and in different time periods to our advantage and ultimately to everyone's advantage. The counterfactual, which is the theme of our event this morning, morning for me, evening for you all in Asia, that what would the world look like without rules is not one that's in China's or the US interest as well. So yes, there's competing system, there's competing values. You think it's tough on industry, wait till we get to rules around data and digital and new technology. But the only way to get around that is to sit down face to face and create some framework within which to operate. Rules might be strong, framework is something we have to go at. We did find, and if I might just spend 30 seconds on TRIPS, yes, TRIPS is restrictive to developing countries, but within that, there's a vast range of experience. Some developing countries have still managed to create innovative economies, despite TRIPS. Others have not. So we cannot see rules as being straitjackets. We also have to understand how we work within them. And I think this question of different systems and rules is exactly what the next 50 years of global governance will be mediating.
Fernando, for his last words. Fernando.
Here you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, I think that we're in deep trouble. No, the whole situation, the world situation, is very complicated. The WTO was in crisis before the health crisis. But what I believe is that this provides us with the possibility of fixing the building when we start moving really into a negotiating.
Oh, we've lost you. Fernando's connection seems to be weak. Can I now turn to Juliana for her last words? Juliana?
I have to thank you very much. I have no questions and no comments. I will try to catch up in the chat, Pradeep, because I have some points for me. So thank you very much. Greetings from the very south coast, Buenos Aires. So thank you very much. I will keep on the chat a few minutes. So if you let me, thank you very much.
We'll keep it alive. Alejandro?
Thank you. I've enjoyed this very much. Let me say something about China. When China joined the WTO, there was the expectation that there would be a convergence of the Chinese economy. And I think it happened to an extent, but then it stalled somewhat. A convergence towards a different model. Economic model, I mean, more market-oriented. And I think it was greater control by the central government of China, mainly for domestic political reasons in China. And on the other hand, so when this convergence stalled, the question is whether they can coexist now. But on the other hand, when you see what the United States has done, using tariff and other measures to protect its industry, what it's doing is changing the allocation of resources in the economy from one sector to another. Well, somebody's paying that bill, but that's their problem. But it's pick and choosing the winners through government fiat intervention. So maybe in a way, both of them are converging to something else. Like Rohinton said, there's a sort of a mix, quite a mixed picture here. And I fully commend Paul Bluestein's book. It's fabulous, like all the things he writes. The other question that was posed about export restrictions. I think we have rules in the system about export restrictions. For example, Article 11 of the GATT. Having said that, I think we need to improve the rules. We need, again, more transparency, more impact analysis of what these restrictions imply, how they will affect others, etc. And I think you need processes whereby to discuss what is the impact of a restriction by one country or another. But mind you, if we are to improve the rules, we're going to have a negotiation. In reality, the negotiation is going to be about the exceptions, because I cannot conceive of a system that does not allow for export restrictions without a safety valve. And the safety valve has to define when, under what circumstances can a country use export restrictions to meet some of its public policy interest or needs in times of emergency. So that will be, I think, a crucial thing that has to be addressed. And that will be the core of any negotiation in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, we come to an end to this webinar. And as I said, a recording of this would be available on our website. And you're welcome to and we are doing a similar webinar on 15th of July, for which also there is a notice will come on our website. And you're welcome to come to that. That is more central to the world. It is for our participants from Europe. With that, thank you very much, and good day to all of you, and good evening to those who are here in this part of the world. Thank you, Rohinton. Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Fernando. And it was lovely. It was an excellent event, and I'm so happy that that you were there, all of you. Goodbye.